The last accessory we need to model is clothing. And I've already mentioned how I want to put a hoodie on this person. I think it's going to match their aesthetic, but also I think the hoodie workflow is an interesting one to learn from. It's fairly robust in terms of process. And so when it comes to process, there are 3 different methods that I've used to create clothing. And the main factor that distinguishes them is the quality of the wrinkles. Because there are some kinds of clothing that try to minimize wrinkles. For example, a sports coat. And then there are other types of fabrics like silk that really need believable wrinkles in order to succeed as a model. And so method number 1 is more for low wrinkle fabrics. And that process starts as modeling the clothing as a shell, kind of surrounding the model as if they're wearing the clothing. And then it's followed by sculpting wrinkle accents on top of that shell. And I especially find this useful for uniform type clothing, or again, like a suit and tie. Since the wrinkles are minimal, it's not really worth the hassle of simulating such types of clothing. Now, the second method models the clothing the same way, kind of encapsulating the character, a shell version of the clothing. And then you basically hit the simulate button and let that fabric fall onto the character's body. The idea being that the simulation would take over and create some realistic wrinkles. But this method really doesn't work well in my experience. I don't use it much anymore unless it's a quick and dirty project. But the simulation is the right idea in terms of maximum realism, which brings us to our third method. And this is to model and simulate the clothing as close to real life as possible, meaning we don't model a shell version of the clothing. That's not how clothing is made. Instead, clothing is cut into separate panels of fabric or a pattern, and then those separate panels are sewn together. And that method by far produces the most realistic clothing. If you've ever seen Marvelous Designer, that's the kind of workflow we will be emulating in Blender. And I'll be the first to say Blender is not ideal for this process. Marvelous Designer is much better, but it can be done with Blender so long as we are patient and thorough in the way we approach it. So let's get to it. The first thing we need to do is model the separate panels of clothing, which is referred to as a pattern. And if you're like me, you've never spent much time at all sewing, especially not making actual clothing. Thankfully, there's this tool called the internet. And if we type in hoodie pattern, that should return some results that clothing makers use, right? So if we go to this image, for example, it shows you the individual panels of clothing, but it doesn't show you how it looks in its final form, so it's a little bit confusing. I'm sure clothing makers have no problem interpreting this, but I find it most helpful, let's see, something like this, where it identifies that this is one half of the hood, that you need 2 pieces of this. Here's the pocket, the back, the front, and the sleeve, right? And that's what goes into making the final hoodie. And so this kind of tailor workflow takes some getting used to. It's definitely not my natural way of approaching it, but trust me when I say that the results pay off in realism. And so if you're modeling any other type of clothing, like a dress pattern, for example, the internet is going to be your friend for how to model those panels of fabric for simulation. And to assist us with this modeling process, I've created my own pattern for us to use specific to a hoodie, and I think a little more readable as a 3D artist. So let me open that image. You'll find it in your reference folder, hoodiepattern.png. If we maximize this, I've color coded it as well as labeled it, so it's very obvious which piece of the pattern goes where in the final article of clothing. And even though I've outlined the entire hoodie, we don't need the entire hoodie. Typically with a portrait, you're looking at the shoulders and up, and so we will be cutting off the simulation and thus the model about halfway through the sleeves and about halfway into the torso, maybe a little bit lower in the torso. So we can omit the B pocket, for example. But this pattern will make it very easy for us to trace a mesh model that we will simulate. And I want to bring this into the 3D view as an image plane. So I'm going to hit 1 on the number pad to go into front orthographic. And then the best way to bring in the image plane, in my experience, is opening a file browser, grabbing that hoodiepattern.png, and clicking and dragging to the 3D viewport. Okay, here we can use the completed hoodie pattern to judge the scale of our final hoodie. Now I need to adjust the settings a bit. Make sure that we have opacity enabled. Let's go to like 0.3. And then I'm going to scale this up basically so that the bottom of our portrait kind of collarbone area fits within the hoodie, and the hood also fits around the head. So just ballparking the scale about like this. I think that should be fine. And then in theory, our panels will be the proper scale as well, because that will matter in the simulation, whether it's a baggy piece of clothing or a tight piece of clothing, that sort of thing. And then from here, I can turn off selectability for that image plane. Might as well name it. And then we can add a new mesh. I'm going to hit Shift-C to put our cursor back at the center of the world. Shift-A, mesh plane. And let's rename this to be hoodie. All right. I'm going to tab into edit mode and just grab one of the vertices. Shift-D to duplicate it. Control-I to invert and delete the rest. We will be edge modeling the pieces of this pattern, one vertex at a time. We'll turn off proportional editing. And with that vert selected, control right clicking will start to extrude out new verts and therefore new edges. And if you're asking why this size of edge, honestly, it's a little bit random because this vert count is not going to be the final vertex count. But what's most important here is that there's enough vertices to cleanly identify the shape. But it's not like a game model. We're not trying to keep them minimal. Remember, when it comes to simulation, you need a lot of geometry to capture that wrinkle detail. And so we do want even this base mesh to be on the higher end in terms of poly count. And so the most important thing is that each of these is consistent. But I'll show you how we can make sure they're consistent. But you should be able to kind of eyeball this size of edge and continue extruding that all the way around until we complete the border of our hoodie pattern. Okay, so I got a little bit sloppier in terms of edge length. Obviously, this edge is not the same size as this, but that's okay. I want to show you now how you can make sure that it's a consistent edge length. You need to make sure that you have the Loop Tools add-on enabled. If you go to User Preferences and Add-ons, I probably showed you how to do this in an earlier video, but that was a long time ago and I forgot. So we were looking for Loop Tools, all right? Make sure you have that enabled. And then Alt-clicking on this edge, you can right-click Loop Tools and Space. Now, I don't recommend doing it on the whole border. I recommend you doing one side at a time. So right-click Loop Tools and Space. Now that will keep the shape of the curve, but make the distance between each vertex consistent. All right, so we'll do that all the way around. Though it's really a little too early to be doing that, because the next thing we need to do is fill the patch inside of this border. And so the way I'm going to do this is E to extrude these verts out to give it a nice kind of extruded interior face, or face loop rather. And then we will continue, we will extrude this as well, make that the active element, and change to active element for our pivot point. We'll scale up, kind of simulating the extrusion inward. And then let's connect here. Whoops, I think I forgot one. And I'll go ahead and make that Loop Tools Space. And then it's going to be a matter of kind of connecting these as a patch using clean topology. All right, this is very similar, identical in fact, to the retopology that we did on our head mesh. So it should be fairly natural to you to pick this process up. However, we're going to run into a problem where we only have two verts here, but we have a ton of verts kind of adjacent to it. All right, so we'll probably need another edge loop down here, or maybe adjust. That's probably what we should do. All right, so we get at least one new vertex here. And let's see, if we connect to the 3, 1, 2, 3. Whoops. And then let's see, we've got 3 verts here that we need to connect over here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we just need one additional one here. Okay, so now is when the spacing tool comes in handy, right? We kind of evenly patched in the middle, but it's wonky geometry. So let's Alt-click here, right-click, Loop Tool Space, do that all the way around. And Shift-R does work here too. All right, then we'll select all the border edges with Shift-Alt-clicking, Control-I to invert, and Vertex Smooth Vertices. And then we'll hold Shift-R until that is nice and clean. All right, so that is an excellent patch. We can move on to the next one, Shift D to duplicate, and let's start here. Typically what I like to do is right click a straight edge whenever the pattern is straight, right? So that is 3 of these 6 sides, is that right? 5 sides, no, 6. And then for the curve, we'll just extrude about the same amount that we did in the last patch, right? So this is the same as retopology. I kind of have a default length that I like to extrude out. And it's what, like 1/8 the size of an edge, something like that. Certainly enough to capture the contours. And then we'll do the same here. Let's see, maybe that last one was unnecessary. And once I have my border defined, I can start to patch on the inside. Right? The number of verts that I'm cutting is just to try and keep each polygon as square as possible, just like retopology. And then we'll need to add a junction in here to alter the flow of the geometry. All right, so then these will all go down. SZ0. We'll find a good place to make it connect. And then that leaves us with 1, 2, 3. Let's see. I should actually probably go one more. Usually around curves like this, I try not to put a star junction on the border. I think that's just a little bit too stretchy or extreme. So then I need, how many is this? 5 verts along the bottom. Okay, now we will right click on each border edge, loop tools space. Whoops, I must not have everything filled. Yeah. Okay, try that again. Loop tool space, loop tool space. Okay, and we'll do the smoothing of the interior verts. Select the border edge, Control I to invert the selection, and Shift L on the other patch so we don't affect those verts, and vertex smooth vertices. Shift R a bunch of times till it's nice and clean. Now, this is where it gets a little bit trickier. Because remember, our patches need to sew together and the vertices need to match. For the best result, it needs to match perfectly. So we need to think about how this pattern will be stitched. For one, let's think about the hood. Now this is just 1/2 of the hood. So we will essentially be duplicating this, moving it down for the other side of the hoodie, but then they will sew together at the corners, which means this becomes our hole in the neck, which leaves us with 16 verts. All right, so we'll leave that there. This is just for visualization's sake. Now, this panel is only 1/4, right? So we will need to duplicate this, flip it over in X to get the other side, merge these two, and then duplicate again, SZ-1, and then connect to get the rest of the neck hole. And then this neck hole will sew together with this one. All right, so how many verts are over here? We're at 20 verts. And so this is, what was it, 16? I've already forgotten. We're 4 verts different, which means the hoodie needs 4 additional verts. Divide that by 2, and this patch needs 2 additional verts at the bottom border specifically. All right, so we'll delete that. And I think I'll cut one this way. So we add a vert on the face hole opening of the hoodie. And then I'll also cut one vertically, which gives us 2 additional verts on the bottom edge. And then we'll use that loop tool space technique. And then smooth out the interior, Control I, deselect what's not needed, vertex, smooth vertices, and then hold Shift R until that is nice and clean. And now let's double check. Shift D to duplicate. We will merge. Or if you want to save a step, you might realize that to get the other half, it's basically duplicating this number. So 11 times 2 is 22, minus the 2 ends is 20. But to visualize it, and therefore teach it, I think merging is a little bit clearer. And so now we should have 20 verts here, 20 verts here. All right, and we'll need to do that with our other panels too. Let's move on to the C panel. Shift D will duplicate it because it's going to sew directly here. So it makes sense to just duplicate those. And then we will extrude down. Let's see, we'll go maybe 3/4 of the way. The only thing to keep in mind about making this a shorter distance is that the weight of the fabric will be less. So if I pulled it up only here, in other words, used only the minimal amount of fabric that we will see in the end product, then you risk getting an unrealistic simulation because a top that's cut off here doesn't pull down as much due to gravity as if it were longer. And so I do want to pull this down, even though most of this will not be seen in the final result. Pulling it down will help it simulate a little more realistically. I'm just going to turn that a little bit, rotate it since the bottom edge is rotated, and then cut enough edges to make that the polygon square, and that should be good enough. Next, we'll select this patch minus the temporary visualization, Shift D, duplicate, and then I'll SX -1, and then we'll move this into position. Now, at first glance, it might look like it's a duplicate, but clearly the neck hole in the back is pulled up a little bit. So we'll need to manually position these verts into the new template shape. Okay, and then we can try and see what it looks like. Loop tool space, and try smoothing the interior verts. Shift L to deselect the others. Vertex, smooth vertices. And whoops, I accidentally selected those. And you know, honestly, I'm not even going to smooth the interior again because these edges are much bigger than the corresponding. So I need to add some new edges in here. How am I going to do that? I feel like if I could limit the additional edges to just this side and not make them affect the others, that would be ideal. So what if we add a diamond junction right here? All right, that gives me two new edges, two new verts on that side. Loop tool space, that looks more consistent in terms of spacing. Let's see what it looks like whenever we smooth the interior. All right, hold Shift R. And I mean, that looks okay. This vert has some significant strain on it. Maybe that's fine because this is the back where the hoodie will cover it. So we're going to be doing enough work to it. I don't think that's going to be a big deal because this isn't even going to be the final mesh. We're going to subdivide it, apply the subsurf, and yeah, I think it'll work out fine. The last thing we need to model is the sleeve. And this is another point of stitching. So let's duplicate this, count how many verts we need. All right, we're looking at 16 total verts. All right, so I'll go back to front orthographic and I'm just going to quickly outline this shape, not pressuring myself to perfectly extrude 16 verts, but mostly just to get the shape. And hopefully I'm below 16 verts so I can simply add those and then smooth. Okay, I am under 16, we're at 14, so Control R will add 2 more. Right click, loop tools, and space. And just clean that up, make sure it matches our template. Excellent. And then again, with a border, I do like to extrude inside, and we can do this quicker. If we extrude with E, there we go. And then I can start thinking about where to put some quad junctions. All right, probably closer to the top. So in other words, we'll take these 4 verts, E, Z, and they will connect there into quads, and then connect here. Or actually, we'll connect here first. And what I could do is another one of these corner quads. I don't think I'm going to like that though. So I think from here we can just extrude all of these down. SZ0. And again, we're not going to go the entire sleeve, but enough of the sleeve so that it simulates realistically. Right click, loop tool space, and then cut enough edge loops so that we get fairly square geometry. All right, once around, we'll make sure that the vertex spacing is clean, and then we'll smooth the interior. There we go. Nice and clean geometry. Now, wait a minute. I think I messed up. It just occurred to me that we need 16 verts, and we have 16 verts, but we need to subtract one because these two will become one. So I actually need one less edge loop. Let's just
delete one from the center, move this one over.
I went the wrong way. I didn't need to subtract an edge loop. I needed to add another one. Well, now I need to add 2. And then let me check the math. All right, so we're up to 17, subtract 1 gets us to 16. Sheesh. See how it can be a little confusing? You've got to be on your game in terms of awareness and how these patches are going to stitch together, how many verts you have. So let me correct this a second time in a row. Excellent. That looks good. And at this point, I think we have a good set of patches that will all stitch together cleanly. I can remove our temporary stitch count edges. And, oh, except for one thing, I need to extrude enough of this back patch to make sure it connects over here to the green one. And okay, so we have these 2 verts, or 3 verts that connect over here, which means I need, that will also connect here. So I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I need 5 here in the middle. All right, and then that should connect over to these for a total of 9. And I should be able to subtract 1, 10. Okay, yes, that math works out. And now I feel good that we have our patches adequately modeled. In the next lesson, we can start the simulation process.